In the heart of West Africa, in the country of Burkina Faso, a man was about to change everything. His name was Thomas Sankara. He was not just a leader. He was a revolution. A different kind of leader. Sankara was not born into power. He came from a simple background. He was a soldier. But unlike many soldiers, he didn't just follow orders. He asked questions. Dangerous questions. Questions about justice. About equality. About freedom. The mind that saw the truth. As Sankara grew older, he saw the reality around him. Poverty. Corruption. Foreign control. His country was rich in resources. But the people were poor. This did not make sense to him. And he refused to accept it. The rise of a revolutionary. Sankara joined the military. But his thinking was different. He believed the army should protect the people. Not control them. He became popular. Especially among young soldiers. Because he spoke the truth. And people felt it. The turning point. In the early 1980s, Burkina Faso was unstable. Leaders were changing. Power was shifting. And in this chaos, Sankara saw an opportunity. Not for power. But for change. In 1983, everything changed. Thomas Sankara became the leader of Burkina Faso. But he didn't call himself a ruler. He called himself a servant of the people. A leader who lived differently. Sankara was not like other leaders. He sold expensive government cars. He reduced his own salary. He lived simply. Because he believed. Backhand index pointing right, a leader should not be richer than the people. The shock to the system. He introduced big changes. He fought corruption. He promoted women's rights. He encouraged people to work for their own country. He rejected foreign control. And this shocked many powerful people. The enemies begin to rise. Because when you challenge the system fights back. Powerful people felt threatened. Both inside the country. And outside. Sankara was becoming too dangerous. Not because of weapons. But because of ideas. The beginning of a revolution. For the people, he was a hero. For the powerful, he was a problem. And this was just the beginning. Because the road he chose was not an easy one. When Thomas Sankara took power in Burkina Faso in 1983, he didn't waste time. He didn't make empty promises. He didn't wait. He acted. A leader who changed everything. One of the first things Sankara did was something no one expected. He changed the name of the country. From Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meaning land of honest people. This was not just a name change. It was a message. A message that a new era had begun. War against corruption. Sankara knew one thing. Corruption was destroying his country. So he took strict action. Government officials were forced to live simple lives. Luxury was removed. Expensive cars were sold. And something unbelievable happened. Even ministers had to use normal cars. People were shocked. Because this had never happened before. A leader who lived like the people. Thomas Sankara refused to live like a rich leader. He wore simple clothes. Years had passed since the shocking assassination of backhand index pointing right unnecessary government spending. The trials were over. Because he believed. Justice had been served. Backhand index pointing right, but leader must feel the life of his people was far from over. And this made him even more remembered. Women's rights, Burkina Faso, move. Schools taught about his life. One of his most powerful actions Children was learned about women. Honesty, courage, he gave and women equal rights. Even in towns and villages, forced marriages, statues and murals reminded everyone of a man who dared to dream of a fairer world. In a time when this was rare, inspiration across Africa. This was revolutionary. His influence but not everyone liked Burkina Faso. Sankara
across
encouraged
Africa
people to work
leaders,
together, activists,
and
he started
ordinary
national
citizens
campaigns
spoke
of Sankara's reforms
to build
courage
schools
and vision, to plant trees,
movements for transparency,
to improve
equality,
health, and independence.
He believed
drew
that the country
from
should
his
depend
life.
on itself.
He became more
Not
than a
on
leader.
foreign powers.
He became a symbol.
And slowly,
lessons
people
for the future.
started believing in him.
Sankara taught people that leadership is about sacrifice. But while the people supported him,
living like your people,
powerful forces were becoming uncomfortable.
about speaking truth to power
inside
even
the country.
when the cost is high.
Some leaders were
His
unhappy.
life was proof that one person's
They were losing
courage
their
can
power,
shake a nation.
their
The
privileges,
global recognition,
their control,
international organizations,
and outside the country,
historians, and
foreign
journalists
powers
highlighted
were
his
watching.
work.
Books were
Closely.
written. Because Sankara
Documentaries
was
made.
not following their system.
His speeches were translated
the dangerous
and shared
idea.
across the world.
Sankara
The
had a bold
revolutionary
idea.
who was once silenced was
Africa
now
should be
celebrated
independent.
globally.
Not
The spirit
controlled by
lives on.
outside nations.
Even decades
He
later,
openly spoke
Sankara's
against
spirit
foreign
remained
influence.
alive. And this made him
Activists
dangerous.
referenced his
policies.
Very dangerous.
Youth movements carried his
because
messages.
powerful systems.
And in every discussion
not like
about
to be
African
challenged.
independence, equality,
Enemies in the
and
shadows.
integrity, his name shone
Now,
bright.
Sankara was
A
no
dream
longer
that
just a leader.
endures. He
Though
was
he
a threat.
died too young.
And threats are
His
removed.
vision endured.
Quietly.
People remembered the simple man
Slowly.
who
Carefully.
fought corruption,
People began
empowered
to whisper.
women. There are
Promoted
plans.
self-reliance.
Something is coming.
Believed in honesty above
but no
all.
one knew when.
And in every
or
corner
how.
of Burkina Faso,
The calm
his dream
before the
continued
storm.
to inspire.
Everything looked strong on the outside. The country was changing. The people had hope. The leader was fearless. But behind the scenes, a storm was building. A dangerous one. By the mid-1980s, Thomas Sankara had transformed Burkina Faso in ways no one had imagined. The people supported him. The country was changing. Hope was growing. But behind this progress, danger was rising. The leader who refused to compromise. Sankara was not a man who made deals. He did not compromise with corruption. He did not bow to pressure. He did not stay silent. And this made him different. But it also made him alone. The growing tension. Inside the government, things were changing. Some leaders were unhappy. They felt ignored. They felt controlled. They felt that Sankara was becoming too powerful. Too independent. Too unpredictable. And slowly, loyalty began to turn into doubt. A friend turns into a threat. Among those close to Sankara was a man many trusted. Backhand index pointing right Blaise Compaoré. He was not just an officer. He was Sankara's friend. His ally. Someone who stood beside him during the revolution. But power changes people. And sometimes, the biggest danger comes from the closest ones. Rumors began to spread. Quietly. Slowly. People started whispering. There is tension between them. There are disagreements. No one knows what will happen next. But Sankara continued his work. Focused. Fearless. Unaware of how close danger really was. The day everything changed. October 15, 1987. A normal day. Or at least, it seemed normal. Sankara was attending a meeting. Calm. Confident. Focused on the future of his country. And then, suddenly, everything changed. The sound of gunfire. Without warning. Gunshots were heard. Chaos erupted. People ran. Panic spread. And in a matter of moments, the revolution was attacked. The final moments. Thomas Sankara did not run. He did not hide. He stood. Because he believed in what he had built. But sometimes, belief is not enough. The betrayal. The attack was not from outside. It was from within. A coup. A betrayal. And behind it was someone no one expected. Backhand index pointing right blaze compare. A friend. An ally. Now, the reason everything ended. The end of a revolution. That day, Thomas Sankara was killed. Just like that. A leader. A visionary. A man who tried to change everything. Gone. The silence after. After the gunfire stopped. There was silence. Heavy silence. The kind that comes after something powerful ends. The revolution was over. But the story was not. The gunfire had stopped. The chaos was over. But in Burkina Faso, everything had changed. The revolution was gone. And a new power had taken its place. The rise after the fall. After the death of Thomas Sankara, one man stepped forward. Backhand index pointing right blaze compare. He announced that he was now in control. He did not call it betrayal. He called it a correction. A correction of Sankara's policies. But many people knew the truth. This was not a correction. This was a takeover. The story was changed. Soon after taking power, Compare began to change the narrative. He claimed that Sankara had made mistakes. He said the country needed a different direction. He tried to control the story. Because controlling the story means controlling the truth. Fear returns quietly. At first, things looked calm. No loud violence. No open chaos. But slowly, fear returned. Not in the same way as before. But quietly. Carefully. People became cautious again. They stopped speaking openly. Because they didn't know who to trust. The changes begin. Many of Sankara's policies were reversed. The simple lifestyle of leaders began to disappear. Foreign relations were restored. Old systems started coming back. And the revolutionary spirit began to fade. The people who remembered. But not everyone forgot. Many people still remembered Thomas Sankara. They remembered his speeches. His courage. His vision. They remembered a leader who lived like them. And this memory became dangerous. Because memories can inspire change. The gunfire had stopped. The chaos was over. But in Burkina Faso, everything had changed. The revolution was gone. And a new power had taken its place. The rise after the fall. After the death of Thomas Sankara, one man stepped forward. Backhand index pointing right blaze compare. He announced that he was now in control. He did not call it betrayal. He called it a correction. A correction of Sankara's policies. But many people knew the truth. This was not a correction. This was a takeover. The story was changed. Soon after taking power, Compare began to change the narrative. He claimed that Sankara had made mistakes. He said the country needed a different direction. He tried to control the story. Because controlling the story means controlling the truth. Fear returns quietly. At first, things looked calm. No loud violence. No open chaos. But slowly, fear returned. Not in the same way as before. But quietly. Carefully. People became cautious again. They stopped speaking openly. Because they didn't know who to trust. The changes begin. Many of Sankara's policies were reversed. The simple lifestyle of leaders began to disappear. Foreign relations were restored. Old systems started coming back. And the revolutionary spirit began to fade. The people who remembered. But not everyone forgot. Many people still remembered Thomas Sankara. They remembered his speeches. His courage. His vision. They remembered a leader who lived like them. And this memory became dangerous. Because memories can inspire change. The silence of justice. One of the biggest questions remained unanswered. What really happened that day? Who planned it? Why did it happen? But no investigation moved forward. No answers were given. Because sometimes truth is hidden on purpose. The leader who stayed in power. Backhand index pointing right Blaise Compaoré stayed in power for many years. He controlled the country. He controlled the system. And for a long time, no one challenged him. Because the cost of speaking out was too high. The shadow of Sankara. Even though Sankara was gone, his presence remained. Not physically, but in the hearts of the people. His ideas. His courage. His dream. They refused to disappear. The beginning of something new. Years passed. The world changed. The country moved forward. But deep inside, something was building. Something silent. Something powerful. The people were watching. Waiting. Remembering. Years passed after the death of Thomas Sankara. Time moved on. New generations were born. Life in Burkina Faso continued. But something never disappeared. The memory. A name that refused to fade. Even though the government tried to move forward, people still remembered Sankara. Quietly. In conversations. In homes. In hearts. His name became more than just a memory. It became a symbol. A symbol of honesty. Of courage. Of real leadership. The youth began to ask questions. As years passed, a new generation grew up. Young people who had never seen Sankara. But they had heard stories. Stories from parents. From elders. From those who lived through his time. And they started asking questions. Who was he really? What happened to him? Why was he killed? The silence starts to break. For a long time, people were afraid to speak. But slowly, that fear began to weaken. Voices started rising. Not loudly at first, but clearly. People wanted answers. They wanted truth. And once people start asking questions, silence cannot last forever. Inside the country, pressure began to grow. Activists. Journalists. Citizens. They all began demanding the same thing. Backhand index pointing right justice for Thomas Sankara. This was no longer just about the past. This was about truth. And accountability. The world starts watching again. The story of Sankara was not just local anymore. It began to spread internationally. People outside Burkina Faso started learning about him. His ideas. His reforms. His assassination. And the world began to ask. Why was justice never done? The power begins to shake. Backhand index pointing right Blaise Compaoré had been in power for many years. But now, things were changing. The people were no longer silent. They were no longer afraid. They were remembering. And remembering is powerful. Because memory can turn into resistance. The beginning of the end. Protests began to rise. Voices became louder. People gathered. They demanded change. They demanded answers. And for the first time in years, the system began to shake. The truth could not be hidden anymore. No matter how long the truth is hidden, it always finds a way out. And now, the truth about Sankara was coming back. Stronger than ever. For years, backhand index pointing right Blaise Compaoré had ruled Burkina Faso. Quietly. Carefully. With control. But nothing lasts forever. The people rise again. It started slowly. Small protests. Small gatherings. People speaking, after years of silence. But this time, it was different. This time, the people were not afraid. They had waited too long. They had remembered too much. And now, they were ready. The spark that ignited everything. In 2014, something happened that changed everything. Backhand index pointing right Blaise Compaoré tried to change the constitution. He wanted to stay in power longer. But the people saw this clearly. This was not leadership. This was control. And they refused to accept it. The streets fill with voices. Suddenly, the streets were full. Thousands of people. Marching. Shouting. Demanding change. This was no longer fear. This was resistance. The kind that cannot be stopped easily. The power begins to break. The government tried to control the situation. But it was too late. The people were united. And when people unite, power begins to shake. Buildings were surrounded. Leaders were pressured. The system was under attack. Blaise Compaoré was no longer in full control. The same people who had stayed silent for years were now demanding his removal. Loudly. Clearly. Fearlessly. The final decision. As pressure increased, Compaoré faced a choice. Stay. And face the anger of the people. Or leave. And lose everything. The same decision many leaders face. The escape. And just like that, history repeated itself. Backhand index pointing right Blaise Compaoré fled the country. Quietly. Without power. Without control. The man who ruled for decades was gone. The moment of victory. When the news spread. The streets erupted. People celebrated. They shouted. They cried. Because after years of waiting, change had finally come. The return of hope. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was more than just a political moment. It was emotional. It was powerful. It was the return of hope. And deep inside, one name echoed again. Backhand index pointing right Thomas Sankara. After the fall of backhand index pointing right Blaise Compaoré, everything began to change in Burkina Faso. For the first time in decades, there was hope. Real hope. The doors finally open. For years, the truth had been locked away. Hidden. Silenced. Ignored. But now, those doors were opening. The new leadership allowed investigations. Files that were once secret were now being examined. And the past was coming back. The call for justice. People across the country began demanding one thing. Backhand index pointing right justice for Thomas Sankara. This was no longer just about history. This was about truth. About accountability. About giving a voice to someone who had been silenced. The investigation begins. An official investigation was launched. Witnesses were called. Evidence was collected. Questions were asked. Difficult questions. Dangerous questions. The kind of questions that had been avoided for years. The past comes alive. Stories started to emerge. Details about that day in 1987. What happened? Who was involved? How the plan was carried out. And slowly, a clearer picture began to form. All eyes once again turned toward backhand index pointing right Blaise Compaoré. The man who had ruled for years. The man who had taken power after Sankara's death. Now, his past was being questioned. A nation watching closely. The entire country was watching. Listening. Waiting. Because this was not just a case. This was history. And how it would be judged would define the future. The emotional return. For many people, this moment was emotional. Families who had suffered. People who had lived through that time. They finally felt heard. Finally felt seen. Finally felt that truth mattered. The beginning, not the end. But justice is not instant. It takes time. It takes courage. And it takes truth. This was just the beginning. The spirit that never died. Even after all these years. Backhand index pointing right. Thomas Sankara was still present. In ideas. In memories. In the fight for justice. Because some leaders never truly disappear. Years after the death of Thomas Sankara, the moment had finally arrived. The trial had begun. In Burkina Faso, history was no longer hidden. It was being questioned, in front of the world. The courtroom of truth. The courtroom was not just a place of law. It was a place of history. A place where the past was being reopened. Witnesses sat quietly. Lawyers prepared their arguments. And the nation watched, closely. Because this was not just a trial. This was the search for truth. The names that shocked everyone. As the trial began, names started to appear. Important names. Powerful names. People who were once untouchable. Now. They were being questioned. And at the center of it all. Was one name. Backhand index pointing right. Blaise Compaoré. The story of that day. Witnesses described what happened on October 15, 1987. The meeting. The sudden attack. The gunshots. The chaos. Details that had been hidden for years. Were now spoken out loud. Clear. Direct. Unavoidable. The truth comes out. Piece by piece. The truth started to form. This was not an accident. This was not confusion. This was a planned operation. A betrayal from inside. And the more the court heard, the clearer it became. The absence that spoke loudly. Backhand index pointing right. Blaise Compaoré was not present in the courtroom. He was living in exile. Far away. But even in his absence, his presence was strong. Because every question, every answer, pointed back to him. The emotional impact. The courtroom in Burkina Faso was packed. Decades of silence, fear, and betrayal were about to meet their reckoning. All eyes were on the judges. All ears were waiting for the verdict. A nation holds its breath. People outside the courtroom waited. News spread across the country. Families of those who lived through Sankara's era gathered. Even young citizens, who had only heard stories, followed every detail closely. This was more than a trial. It was the validation of decades of pain and hope. The verdict begins. After months of testimonies, evidence, and shocking revelations. The moment had come. The lead judge stood up. The room fell silent. Even the journalists stopped typing. The shocking truth confirmed. It was confirmed. Thomas Sankara had been betrayed by those closest to him. The planning, the coup, the assassination, it was all deliberate. Every lie that had been spun for decades now crumbled in the courtroom. Even the exiled former leader, backhand index pointing right Blaise Compaoré, could no longer hide from history. The emotional fallout. The families of Sankara wept openly. People in the streets shouted with relief and sorrow. This was justice, finally. It was painful, yes, but it was truthful. And that truth had the power to heal a nation. The symbolic justice. Though Sankara could never be returned to the people physically, his legacy was acknowledged officially. Documents, speeches, and reforms he had started were restored. Memorials were established. And young generations began to study his life and ideas as a source of inspiration. The lessons learned. The trial taught everyone a lesson. Truth cannot be buried forever. Justice may take years, decades, or even generations. But it comes. And leaders who betray the people cannot escape accountability forever. The spirit lives on. Even after the verdict, Sankara's spirit continued to inspire. People organized movements for freedom, honesty, and equality. His ideas spread beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa. Across the world. The revolutionary who was once silenced was now immortal. Years had passed since the shocking assassination of backhand index-pointing right Thomas Sankara. The trials were over. Justice had been served. But Sankara's story was far from over. A hero remembered. Across Burkina Faso, schools taught about his life. Children learned about honesty, courage, and leadership. Even in towns and villages, statues and murals reminded everyone of a man who dared to dream of a fairer world. Inspiration across Africa. His influence didn't stay in Burkina Faso. Across Africa, leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens spoke of Sankara's reforms, courage, and vision. Movements for transparency, equality, and independence drew inspiration from his life. He became more than a leader. He became a symbol. Lessons for the future. Sankara taught people that leadership is about sacrifice. About living like your people, not above them. About speaking truth to power, even when the cost is high. His life was proof that one person's courage can shake a nation. The global recognition. International organizations, historians, and journalists highlighted his work. Books were written. Documentaries made. His speeches were translated and shared across the world. The revolutionary who was once silenced was now celebrated globally. The spirit lives on. Even decades later, Sankara's spirit remained alive. Activists referenced his policies. Youth movements carried his messages. And in every discussion about African independence, equality, and integrity, his name shone bright. A dream that endures. Though he died too young, his vision endured. People remembered the simple man who fought corruption, empowered women, promoted self-reliance, believed in honesty above all. And in every corner of Burkina Faso, his dream continued to inspire. The story of Thomas Sankara was no longer just a story of a country. It was a story for the world. Of courage, sacrifice, and enduring ideals. Of a man who refused to bow to power, fear, or betrayal. A man who reminded humanity that leaders are meant to serve, not rule.